Wonderful. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to JWA's post-quarantine book talks. We're being optimistic here. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive, and apparently I have not turned off the binging things in the background of my computer. I am so happy to be back with you tonight for the first of our fall series of book talks. I have really missed these gatherings over the last several weeks. And I'm really happy that we had this opportunity tonight to connect. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure you chat to everyone. Please, we love to see who's here and bring your voices in throughout the conversation. Please feel free to share your memories of All of a Kind family and add your questions to the conversation. We're really delighted to be able to continue offering this program and growing this wonderful community. And I want to thank Judaism Unbound for their partnership. Before I introduce our featured speakers for this evening, and before we begin our conversation, I just want to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We take an intersectional approach to Jewish history and culture because we believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us understand the world that we live in and create a better future. The quarantine book talks are just one aspect of JWA's work, and I hope you will check out jwa.org, where you'll find so much more and can explore all of the things that we do and all the resources that we offer. I also want to share that we are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and I hope that you will consider joining us in just a few weeks on Thursday, November 4th, for our virtual anniversary event, and we'll have info in the chat about that and at the end of the program as well. We have a very full agenda tonight as we turn our attention to the beloved series of All of a Kind Family and its author, Sydney Taylor. Sydney Taylor and her series are a great example, to my mind, of why women's stories matter, and they're favorites of ours at JWA. Through the stories of these 5 sisters, as well as other characters like Mama, Papa, Charlie, Uncle Hyman, Lena, the library lady, these books taught generations, really continue to teach Americans about the immigrant experience, about family life. They've become a touchstone for Jews who saw their own experience reflected in these stories, as well as those who knew little about the Jewish community and holidays, and they taught many non-Jews about Jews for the first time. And also helped generations of immigrants of different ethnicities think about their own experiences in a wider perspective, and we'll have a chance to talk about all of that tonight. Tonight, we have the opportunity to talk about the new biography of Sydney Taylor, From Sarah to Sydney, with one of its authors, Alexandra Junietz. The project was initially begun by June Cummins, who is a professor at San Diego State University, where she made important contributions to its National Center for Children's Literature. Cummins wrote and spoke on many subjects related to children's literature and culture, and after her diagnosis of ALS, she devoted her remaining years to finishing this biography of Sydney Taylor, as well as enjoying her family. Alexandra is a historian of the medieval Middle East who has studied in France, Tunisia, and Turkey, and published a monograph on a 15th century judge in Iran. She's currently a researcher at the University of Chicago working on a project on race and religion. But Alex and June met in 1992 and were good friends from then on. And when June could no longer commute to her teaching job in San Diego because of her illness, Alex began visiting her daily to take dictation on the biography of Sydney Taylor. And what began as dictation turned into a real collaboration and partnership. And the publication of From Sarah to Sydney, the woman behind All of a Kind Family, is the fruit of that partnership. And it is a wonderful volume. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very happy to welcome Alex tonight.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
We are also lucky to be joined a little bit later by author and editor Lizzie Skurnick, who recently brought back into print the All of a Kind family books, among many other out-of-print books for kids and young adults. And we'll hear more from her later. So, Alex, welcome. When All of a Kind Family was first published in 1951, it was really groundbreaking. And I hope that people will share their memories of the book in the chat. But in the meantime, can you start us off with a little taste of the book and of Taylor's life?
I'd be delighted to. I'm going to read a section from the beginning of chapter 10, which that chapter is called Award-Winning Author. So until Sydney was in her late 40s. She was a very, very busy woman, but she wasn't known as an author. And then, so I'm now reading from that chapter. Over the years, Taylor explained in a number of speeches and letters how she came to write the first all-of-a-kind family book, adding or subtracting different details while keeping certain themes constant. She told fans that her daughter was often lonely at bedtime, so Taylor spun stories about her own childhood with 4 sisters and eventually a baby brother on the Lower East Side. She wanted both to soothe her daughter with tales of a large family and to preserve and share the values of a vanished lifestyle in the neighborhood where she grew up. She felt compelled to write down the stories and read them to Jo and her friends. Then she put the manuscript in a box where she kept her play scripts and other miscellanea. She did not specify how long the manuscript languished there, but intimated that it was several years. At the end of the summer of 1950, according to her speeches, Taylor asked her husband to dig out a script she wanted to use at Camp Sedgwin. He saw the family stories among her papers, and having recently noticed an announcement for a prize for children's literature, had his secretary type them up and mail them to the sponsor of the prize, the Chicago publishing house of Wilcox and Follett, without telling his wife what he had done. When the letter arrived announcing that Follett planned to publish her stories as a book, Taylor was, quote, flabbergasted, and Ralph's activities on her behalf were revealed. She sat for a while, rocking in the rocking chair in Jo's room, which her daughter had long outgrown, then grabbed her coat and went to see a movie. Taylor was even more astonished to learn that she had won the 2nd annual Charles W. Follett Award in Children's Literature. She had no idea what the prize entailed and had to ask the publisher as late as February 1951 to learn that she had won $3,000 and a gold medal, as well as the publishing contract. In Taylor's telling, she then called her mother long distance because her parents were wintering in Florida. When I got her on the phone, my first words were, modestly, "Mama, you're going to live forever." And Mama replied, "Yes, I know. Everyone tells me how well I look." When I explained what I really meant, she was so excited she spluttered. A few days later, I got a letter from her written at 4 o'clock in the morning. She hadn't been able to sleep. Well, neither had her daughter. But her letter ended with the characteristic question, "Did you say $300 or $3,000?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us that little insight into that moment of transition. But Taylor was 45, I think, when the book was first published. Is that right?
She would have been in 46, 47.
Yeah. So she had a lot of life before then. So let's go back a little bit and talk about the girl, Sarah Brenner, who became Sydney Taylor. Obviously, people often want to think about All of a Kind Family and its autobiographical elements. And, you start the book by saying, people always want to know which one was she? But tell us a little bit about the relationship between the books and her family's background. How much does it actually reflect her family's background? Where are there kind of points of connection and where are there differences?
Well, I would say the thing that people are struck by the most is that the books present a very warm, comforting world. Yes, we are aware that Lena has polio. We are aware of the possibility of terrible accidents. 2 of the children almost end up setting themselves on fire. We know the condition that it's, and we know Papa works hard. But overall, this is a family that always has enough to eat. This is a family where Mama is always kind, and she may be a little strict, but it's a very warm and loving family. In real life, it was a much grimmer picture. I think people are particularly struck by how Mama responded, that she didn't necessarily want that many children that fast. It was very hard for her schlepping the baby carriage up and down the stairs and trying to keep clean. Given her background, she found it very, very difficult. And so I think I also was able to listen to some interviews that Ella and Charlotte did as adult women, actually, after Sidney Taylor died, and their recollections of the poverty and the cold and how difficult it was and how terrifying it was to go into this one toilet for the building where they thought there were rats and there was coal dust everywhere. So I think that's one of the big differences. Now, in terms of actual stories, in one of the books, there's a story of where Henny gets a stain on her daughter Ella's, her sister Ella's fancy dress, and then ends up dyeing it with tea. And apparently that really happened. And I think some of these other events really happened. But again, they're presented in a way, instead of siblings yelling at each other, there's always a resolution. It always comes out fine, and everyone learns something from it. So in that sense, but yeah.
One of the things that I was very interested to learn was about Taylor's mother, who was a German Jew. And of course, the period of immigration, the immigrant community that she's writing about is primarily Eastern European Jews. Most of the German Jewish population had come earlier and was more established by the beginning of the 20th century. And so in the biography, you talk about how in some ways Mama was, or Silly, Brenner was kind of in tension with some of the dynamics, and you referred to that too. Like, she grew up with more Germanic assumptions about cleanliness and propriety, and that made her experience in the tenements particularly difficult and uncomfortable, and that actually they had a lot of this kind of Germanic approach that was not necessarily aligned with all the other immigrants in their community.
Yes, now I don't want to exaggerate that, because really, Silly's family, they were Jews from Poland. They had, because of the father and the business opportunity. So culturally, she had absorbed a lot of German bourgeois culture. But on the other hand, it wasn't quite such a mixed marriage, so to speak, as she really was. She was not unfamiliar with traditional Jewish practice, and clearly there was kashrut in the home and that sort of thing. But yes, it's the one thing that comes through, however, is that her daughters picked up on her feeling different from the rest of the community, and wanting to going to the library and getting out German books and reading German literature, that was important to who she saw herself as. But clearly, it was interesting. We got a lot of different information about, did they speak Yiddish at home? Did they speak German? And it became clear that everything was something of a hodgepodge. It wasn't as if the mother was speaking Hochdeutsch, but on the other hand, some of the Yiddish sounded very strange to the girls, and they were speaking English. But for example, when the brother Jerry was a soldier in World War II, he was in Germany, and there's a letter from his wife where she says, "Oh, I didn't know that you knew enough German that you would be able to, interrogate people or whatever," that she was, and he asked actually for his family to send him a German English dictionary. So it was there, but it's not as if the children, it was more, I think, the values of, yes, cleanliness, order, but that was also very much in keeping with how Americans were seeing what it meant to live properly.
Right, and sort of helped that family become models of Americanization in some ways, which you see throughout the books as well, that it's, that the stories are both stories of Jewish particularity, but also very much making the case for the successful Americanization of Jewish immigrants.
Yes, absolutely. Now, in the books, that effort that comes up in large part because of Sidney Taylor's editor. She was the one who introduced that whole Gentile story of Kathy the library lady, and the whole romance that goes through, and also was very insistent that there be a 4th of July chapter. There we have a letter from her where she says, as we're editing these lovely stories of yours, the family can come across as being a little too isolated. Didn't they know any? She didn't actually say any real Americans, but, didn't they know anybody outside of this world? So that the books themselves were an effort to create this image of integrated Jews. Yes, holding on to their traditions and being very proud of their traditions, but that wasn't in the way of celebrating Thanksgiving, for example, or other holidays.
Right, right. And that some of the other, when there are other non-Jews, they may be other ethnic Americans, right? We have Guido, we have Grace Healy, Ella's friend, once they moved to the Bronx. So they come into contact with other immigrant communities.
And that was reflective of their life. When they did go to the Bronx, they were exposed to many different ethnic groups. Yeah.
So in terms of Americanization, let's talk a little bit about the change from Sarah to Sydney. Tell us a little bit about Sarah's decision to reinvent herself as Sydney and to become Sydney Taylor ultimately.
Well, it's such a fascinating story, partly because the story she told when fans would write to her, why do you have a man's name? Is this your real name? Or even when she was giving talks and whatever, she said that when she was in an acting group, that the name Sarah came across as old-fashioned. And so she felt compelled to have, I guess, a more interesting stage name. But that's not true, because we have from her diaries and letters and journals that she was actually quite young. She was still, it was in high school that she changed her name. And she never really gives a reason. At the time, her friends seem to just take it for granted. You see letters from them where they refer to her as Sarah, Sid, and Sydney all in the same letter. So it's clear that that summer everybody was getting used to it. But there was someone who worked with her at Sedgwick, who features in the book, Ginger, was very insightful. And she said, Sydney Taylor, Sarah Brenner wanted to make a mark. She wanted to be somebody. And the name change was a part of that, of becoming her own person. And I think that, that's very insightful. Her husband, Ralph Taylor, started out as Reuven Schneider, but there's more a sense that, and that was very common for Jews, especially right around the early 30s, which it seems to be that's when he went from Schneider to Taylor, and the rest of his family did as well. It was a business decision, so that I think was much more traditional. What Sydney did really, I do think, was part of how she saw herself as a budding artist, even at that very young age.
So as you said, she is an artist at a young age, but not necessarily a fiction writer to start with. She's more involved in dance and theater and playwriting. And you mentioned Camp Sedgwick, and I've seen in the chat already, we have a lot of Sedgwick people in the audience, which is great. And I hope we'll get to hear a little more about some of their experiences with the Brenner sisters. Tell us a little bit about Sydney's artistic background and context, and maybe a little bit about Camp Sedgwick.
Well, one thing that's very clear is that it was something the entire family valued. And there were relatives, cousins, who actually had fairly successful careers in the movies, on vaudeville. So, and this was something, and for Ella, for example, was a really gifted singer. And the part in Ella of All of a Kind Family, the idea of her having a career on the stage was something that really was considered. And Henny apparently was a very fine dancer. So it was something that all the Brenner sisters did, and they were extremely competitive. So part of it was, I think, finding a niche for themselves and what they were good at. So yes, she did start out uh, primarily doing, she was in the socialist group, and one of the things they did was put on plays and things, even back in the settlement houses and, in the synagogues, they were doing plays and organizing.
Right. In the labor movements, they were doing plays.
Exactly, exactly. And so, and also, her husband, Ralph, was a very fine recorder player and was involved in the early music movement. And he also would play the piano for Martha Graham when they were practicing in the studio. So um, it was just considered essential to life. And if we go back, one of my favorite pictures in the whole book is of Morris Brenner's paper cut that he did back in Europe. And it's just extraordinary, the workmanship. And he made doll houses and was, again, a creative influence in the children's lives. So some of it was just happenstance, where they happened to be, what worked out. And, dancing with Martha Graham was a tremendous opportunity. And so it made sense that when she and her sisters were at Sedgwin, that's where they would excel. That's where they would enjoy interacting with children.
So, you mentioned that she moved in sort of leftist circles. How did that influence her writing? Are there places in the books where we see that kind of showing up?
Well, June wrote a fascinating article where she links, I think it's in More of All of a Kind Family. There's a May Day celebration that the children organize, and they're going to go to the park, and it starts to rain. So then they end up going to the basement of Papa's shop, where all the peddlers from different nationalities, different ethnicities are sitting around. And June has this wonderful interpretation of how this May holiday, which can seem just fun, and they were fairy costumes and one thing and another, was in fact a labor holiday, and that it's for those who are conscious of what many Jews did. Many were involved in the socialist movement, that this was actually seen as a very pro-worker chapter. And I'm pretty sure it's fairly easily accessible online, if you look at June. But for the rest of it, I think it's largely the dignity of work and the importance of work, and that poverty is not at all any indication of shame. It's something that the community that we are responsible for each other. And I think we really see that, for example, with Guido. The family does not hesitate when they see that he is a child in need. They pack up a basket of food. Mama and Ella go, and this is a problem to solve, and this is something to take care of. So again, these were books written for children between the age of 8 and 12. They weren't going to be didactic about any sort of social movement, but in terms of the values of community and the community of working people, I think that is quite obvious.
I'm going to bring Lizzie into our conversation. Just going to take 1 second for me to promote her to a panelist. and she can join and talk a little bit about some of her experience as well. Let's see here, promote panelist. She should be showing up in a minute. As Lizzie appears, one of the things that I was thinking about also in terms of some of the political pieces, I was remembering the scene, I think it's in Ella of All of a Kind Family, where Henny runs for office at school, and she's like very controversial to have a girl run for class president or whatever it is, and the boys sort of mock her, and then the girls organize and come back by mocking them, and they sort of win. And anyway, it's
yes,
very
right. But, and that's really interesting because rereading the books, actually in the very first book, there's a line where Henny says, if I were a boy, I would be a fireman. So there's very much the sense that there are certain jobs that women don't get. And so I thought it was fantastic that when it comes around to this chapter where Henny is the budding suffragette, and there's a whole conversation about, well, women can be president, and we're going to take over the world, and it's real. And again, it's treated in a very lighthearted way, but it's also very serious about, yes, women can do anything.
Right, and the boys come off looking bad because they make it into a joke, and the girls are actually ready to be serious and to debate.
Exactly.
I'm very happy to welcome Lizzie into our conversation. As I said earlier, Lizzie's an author and editor who has written and edited and published many books, and she also is the founding editor of Lizzie Skurnick Books, and as such has reissued dozens of YA classics, including the All of a Kind Family series. Lizzie was featured, some of you may remember, in a quarantine book talk in July of 2020 for her book Pretty Bitches, on being called crazy, angry, bossy, frumpy, feisty, and all the other words that are used to undermine women. And she's also a frequent contributor to the New York Times and NPR and Jezebel and many other publications. And we're really happy to have you with us tonight, Lizzie.
Hi.
Thank you. So we've been talking a little bit about Lizzie Taylor's background and the context for publishing these books. Can you tell us a little bit about how and why the books went out of print, and what the response was to bringing them back?
Well, so the books went out of print, as books do, because they weren't selling, and were not selling enough for the publisher, and there was no one at the publishing company who was championing them. It's very common for young adult books to go out of print, especially in a market as huge and vibrant as this. But June heard this, and she was horrified. And I, at the time, wrote a young adult column for Jezebel, and I had written a lot about the All of a Kind family books. And she called me and she said, what can we do? What's going on? And I said, well, luckily I've just started a publishing in print. So hopefully we can get the rights back from these publishers. Oh, this is June Cummins, who is the scholar the original Sidney Taylor scholar, who is the co-author of the biography. And
actually, I would say she's the main author.
She's
the
main
is
author.
The author of the book.
Yes, yes. She's a brilliant scholar and a tragic too early death. So that is how we met. And one of the greatest parts of reissuing the series was that June wrote forwards to all of the editions that we published at Lizzie Skurnick Books. And in them, she talked about the May Day chapter. She talked about Martha Graham. She was able to tell the readers so much about what had happened to Sydney as an author and Sarah as a girl, as well as things about the books, that we wouldn't have known, why the books sometimes had Gentile characters, what the publisher had done to change the books in order to make them more palatable to non-Jewish readers. So, quote unquote. So that was a great experience. And so it was not only a chance for us to reprint these classics, but to sort of come to a new contemporary understanding about their role in the field of children's literature.
We have a question from Audrey about, how much we know about the readership of All of a Kind Family, and whether, how much non-Jewish girls or kids read the books, or whether this was primarily a Jewish readership.
Well, so I will tell you this, when I used to write the columns about the books, and whenever I spoke about the books, so many readers would tell me that this was their first experience with Jews and Judaism. It was all of the things they learned from the books, about how they made meat kosher, or, going to services, or even just some of the stuff that's about like the Lower East Side, Coney Island life, that later on in life, when they met Jews, they were surprised to find out, that not all Jews were socialist New York Jews of this particular stripe. Yeah, exactly. Like this commenter is saying, I would say some of my non-Jewish friends felt even more strongly about the series because it was such a loving window into a culture that, was just not available to so much of the country.
One of the things that I found really interesting when I started talking about these books with people as an adult was hearing from friends who were not Jewish, but who came from immigrant families, how much they related to the series because of its, because of its theme about Americanization and how you navigate being part of an immigrant community, but also going beyond the immigrant community, and the ways in which immigrant families change over time in response to their surroundings. And that, some of them said it was almost sort of like a guidebook. And these are kids growing up in the 70s, right? Who are in very different contexts and coming from different places, but are realizing like, oh, there were previous generations of people who went through something similar, and I can relate to that and can learn from that. And that was really interesting to me, because I hadn't, I had thought about kind of quote unquote, Americans learning about Jews, about immigrants from the series, but I hadn't really thought about other immigrant populations learning about, in some ways, their own experience through the lens of Jewish experience.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think we've talked about this before. There's this part of all the books about a dress. There's this dress that nobody who's ever read the series can ever forget. It's Ella's dress, and Ella's white dress, and Henny steals it. And those of you who have read the books know that I'm going to talk about the tea dyeing incident. For those of you who haven't read the books, you'll have that to look forward to. But after many, many, many years of studying the books, publishing the books, talking about them with people, I finally decided that that whole episode about taking a white dress and then being forced to stain it with tea, all with tea, but then finding that that new dress is actually better and not ruined, that a lot of that was about the experience of being an immigrant, of integrating into society somewhat without changing, and making a new thing of an old thing. And yeah, I think the books do speak to the sense of what can be wonderful about being an outsider. And I think that's also so valuable for children, because the insiders in these books are the members of the family, the members of the community who they bring into their homes, and not who's cool or who's popular. And I think that was also something that was very important for young girls to see, sort of the primacy of family and community, and not only a social network that only has to do with other children.
Alex, when you started our conversation, with the description of Taylor writing these stories initially for her own daughter, and to give her daughter both a sense of what it was like to live in a large family because she was an only child, but also to allow her to have some representation of Jews in children's literature. The children's literature really didn't have Jewish characters, and she felt like, oh, it'd be great to see oneself represented. That's a theme that's really dear to our hearts at JWA, because a lot of our work is around diversifying that representation. it occurred to me it's very interesting that, that was sort of the seed. The starting place was about making sure that Jewish kids could have representations of Jews in literature, but that actually so much of the impact of the book was about non-Jews seeing representations of Jews in literature, and how that was a kind of unanticipated way in which these books made a difference that maybe was not the initial goal.
Well, it's sort of ironic because the publisher's concern was that the books would be too Jewish, which is why we had these sort of blonde, blue-eyed romantic interests, coming in and out. There's always like a character for someone who is not Jewish to identify with. And as it happens, readers don't really need to identify with people. Readers want to enter another world, not only necessarily see themselves. So you have this series where in parts is sort of tortured into being more mainstream, actually still transcending and, winding up bringing its Mayday and its Judaism and its foreignness, to the rest of the world, which I always think is kind of nice about it too. It's like, I'm sure somebody has said this already, but it's like, the Jewish Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House series. And, I have friends that were like always trying to get salmon skin or spice chickpeas or, eat corned beef or tongue or any of the stuff that they'd learned about in the books. And I'd say, okay, I can get you that if you really need it.
Yes, I love Natalie in the chat said she used to describe this as Little House on the Lower East Side. And
totally.
I loved the piece in the book in the biography where I hadn't thought about this, where you point out the parallelism between in Little House, for those of you who remember those books, Ma has this China shepherdess that goes on the shelf wherever they move, even into their little sod house. It's like a little piece of civilization that lives on a shelf and makes it feel like home and civilized.
Not a whatnot.
Mama, right, exactly. And Mama in All of a Kind Family also has a China shepherdess kind of piece. And I hadn't thought about that, but I think you write about how it served a kind of similar purpose.
Yes, June really was very perceptive about that, about how, again, that was anyone going through any sort of transition, whether you are moving across the Atlantic or whether you're heading west, that it's a job that parents do for their children, is establishing what their values are and who they are. And I think that's one of the ways that the children really related to the book. They might not even have been aware of all that was being told to them at the time about Judaism or whatever. They're also relating to children who lose books, who have to do chores at home, who hear people with funny accents and then are reprimanded by their parents saying, we don't make fun of other people. That many of those experiences, and that was certainly Sydney Taylor's idea, is that children are children no matter what, and that the process of growing up. And one thing she was able to do with having these 5 girls is that readers of a whole variety of ages could identify with one of the children, or they could see themselves, I'm the shy one, I'm the dreamy one, I'm the one who always gets in trouble, and they could age with the girls as well. So I think that was, I don't know how much Sydney Taylor started out realizing in these tiny little books, they're 100 pages long, about how much depth there was but that I think is a testament to what readers bring to books. Also, they bring the depth of their lives and then use literature to think about the things that matter.
You've both talked about what some of the challenges were, from the publisher wanting to Americanize it a little bit or add a little bit more that people who were not part of the world that was being described could relate to. But, the truth is that even with those changes, I would imagine it was a challenging time to put out books like these. These are coming out. First one comes out in 1951. It's the time of the Rosenberg trial. And, there are a lot of reasons why this family could, and some of the issues there raise alarms for people or be considered, kind of a little bit dangerous. And then I think one of the other interesting pieces that relates to that is the publishing history of the series, that certain books are published later. For example, Downtown, All of a Kind Family Downtown, which was written second, doesn't get published then because it is seen as sort of too gritty, too negative. That wasn't really ready until later. Can you talk a little bit, Alex, about sort of that publication history piece of it?
Yes. On one hand, this was clearly, everyone involved was very much aware of this, that it was a sensitive time to be talking about Jews. On the other hand, however, this was after World War II. This is the baby boom. Children's publishing just took off. It just ballooned. And so there were also books about Chinese children. People had been exposed in a way that I think they hadn't been before to just the variety of cultures in the world and the variety of cultures in the United States. So yes, there was concern, but on the other hand, I think that the Judaism part of it was solved pretty much with the first book. But now the idea of Downtown being gritty, again, there was a whole idea that children's books should be comforting, that they should be, that maybe fairy tales, but look, in a fairy tale, the princess always gets the prince, the dragons are slain. And the idea of having books that dealt with much more difficult issues, like being an orphan, poverty, and disease. This was All of a Kind Family and the series came out right at the time when there was a major shift in children's literature, where authors like Judy Blume were dealing with things which had been thought inappropriate before. And so I think that's why we do see Downtown being published in the 70s, not in the 50s. And that the tone of the early books is sort of uniformly more upbeat, but Downtown and Ella deal with I think some more difficult issues.
Yeah, I mean,
go
ahead, Lizzie.
Well, I also think children's publishing, even if you go back to someone, Frances Hodgson Burnett, it's always in denial about how happy and light it is. There's always orphans, there's always dead parents and sickly people and, poverty, like Little Women is also like a story with a lot of death. There's a baby dies in the first, few
right,
pages.
But I do think those were geared to slightly older children.
Well, it's no, I guess I'm not suggesting that those two are the same. I'm just saying that, they're always, I teach children's literature, and every year my students are just continually shocked to see how the books always contain like even more death, violence, poverty, even the happiest books than any of the saddest adult books you can find. And so I think what happened with All of a Kind Family Downtown is that it was explicitly a social justice book. And that was what was different. It wasn't sugarcoating it, or, it really did want you to pay attention to the actual circumstances that Guido, as, someone with a sick mother, would face. And that was really what was noticeable, and a change, and something that, as you say, really only started to become acceptable in the 70s, when books started to become about social justice for women, social justice for people of color, social justice really for, books that existed outside of this white paradigm, outside of this sort of sanitized paradigm. And so it's actually sort of amazing that we get to see that book and that it ever came to light, because it's such an amalgam of, a book kind of like Little Women, actually, but also, a book that could be like a teen novel by like, Robert Zindel or something. It's like a bridge novel.
Right, right.
It was also interesting to me, though, to learn from reading the biography that the publishers were actually in the 70s sort of pushing Taylor to write books that fit more into that kind of problem genre, where there was like a big issue that you had to deal with. And she was sort of saying, well, that's not really how it happened, or, you're trying to kind of like make it more complicated or more, more difficult than it was to fit into that. So it's sort of, it seems like she caught it on both ends. Like she wrote a book that was maybe a little bit too aware of the issues or putting them out there in the early years, and that couldn't get published. And then once that one got published in the 70s, they wanted her to make Ella of All of a Kind Family more, have more internal strife than maybe the story, the way she saw it, warranted.
Yeah, more of like a YA novel, basically. Right. And, the drama in Taylor, came about because of family and community, not necessarily like this sort of inner angst. And I think in the 70s, they really wanted more of that. And that was absolutely not what the series was here to provide the reader for, or what the reader wants from this kind of book.
Right. I mean, I will say that my children, who are now about to turn 15 and have loved All of a Kind Family forever, we have the audiobook as well as the printed books. They still listen to the audiobook as like one of their calming down, I'm trying to fall asleep things. It's like a comfort thing for them. But one of the things when I was learning more about Sydney Taylor that I found so interesting was that her mother actually struggled with depression and mental health issues, and how much that does not show up in the book at all.
Well, I think we find that often actually with children's authors. I mean, Louisa May Alcott, her circumstances were just lunacy. And her father had mental health issues. She grew up in extreme poverty, and you would not know it. And there is a way, I think, in which writers try to resolve these feelings, within their work, so that growing up with a feeling of instability might result in writing books that effectively are soothing, soothing to the author and then soothing, to the reader. I completely reread those books also when I need to chill and not feel all the, and so I think that's actually something we find in the background of authors whose books are like that all of the time.
Louisa May Alcott did write one satirical novel that really takes her father to task for all of his craziness, and that's one of my favorites, Transcendental Wild Oats. If you haven't read that one is actually like, I recommend that one as a real snarky takedown of men transcendentalists and their kind of dreaminess, and how women had to then deal with all of the crap that they
do all the labor. Yeah.
I wanted to get back to something, Alex, that you referenced briefly, which is kind of the larger field of ethnic literature. And I'm curious, like, as Taylor's books were coming out, was there yet a field? How did that develop, and what was the role of All of a Kind Family within that?
Well, I think that was one of the reasons that June felt that this was such an important story to tell, because it's hard for us to realize this now, but it really was groundbreaking, the All of a Kind Family book. And it's not that all of a sudden the dam opened, and, I can defer to Lizzie here, but it was a good 10 years before we have The Snowy Day. And that's even simply, first of all, it's a book written by a Jew, and the character simply is presented as an African American, but there's really nothing in the text. So it was still slow. And the idea also was, and I've read some of these books there are books that about Jews, but were written by non-Jews, about what it meant to be a Jewish teenager growing up outside of Boston, and what it was like to assimilate in the 50s. but it's not written by a Jew, so it comes across as very didactic, and it's not as alive as the All of a Kind family books. Um, but when Taylor was giving speeches in the 60s, she was already remarking, and she said, it's hard for you, my audience, to remember. Now we have all sorts of books about different minorities. But when my book first came out, that simply wasn't available in the way that it is now, just as literature that you would find in a school library. So I do think that and that I think is really what makes Sydney Taylor, not only her life is interesting, but the impact that she had was in opening that door.
If people have questions, don't forget to put them into the chat. And there's lots of great conversation of people's memories of the books. Remember to chat to everyone so we can all see them. Taylor wrote other books that are not well known. I didn't know of any of them actually until Lizzie republished one of them. A Papa Like Everyone Else is one of them, which I think was originally published in 1966. What role did her other books play? And I'm curious, Lizzie, also to hear from you what the response was to A Papa Like Everyone Else when you brought that back.
Well, actually, that book, I don't think it gained that much traction in its time, and it didn't gain that much traction now. I don't know. I think partly because that's a book for slightly younger readers, and that is explicitly an immigrant story. And it may be that particularly in the case of Taylor, she was, sort of like in the May Day incident, she's kind of at her best when she's being a little bit sly. And, she sort of sneaks in a lot of great stuff through these really joyful incidents in the books. And I think something like A Papa Like Everyone Else, also just on a factual note, children's and YA writers of her era and later, they just wrote so many books. I mean, most of the writers I read published in the 70s, slightly younger than Taylor, but they wrote 40 or 50 books, which is just not how teen authors and children's writers necessarily work nowadays. So I think in any writer's career, you can really see like experimentation. A book is really sort of something an editor might say, why don't you try a book about this? And that's literally the only explanation for why the book exists. And then they try it and they publish it. And it's not any more complicated than that. So I've always assumed that that was one of those books where she was attempting to make a bridge between America and the old country, and how those how the girls that were here, where they would have come from, that in A Papa Like Everyone Else, they're not here yet. I love that book. I just, sometimes books take a few generations to really find their readership. So.
Well, I want to say two things about A Papa Like Everything. For one thing, it shows what her editors and some of the readers or some of the reviewers saw as weaknesses in Taylor's writing, which was that it tended to be very episodic, but she needed a lot of help in creating a through-going narrative. And that was one of through all the ones, she would have these great little chapters about dusting or about a trip to Coney Island or whatever.
Right.
But the idea of putting it together as there was some kind of overarching story. The other thing is with A Papa Like Everyone Else, and is that Sydney Taylor was very, very close with a woman, Gertie Holst at Sedgwin, who was diagnosed with cancer and was really very much in denial about what was happening. But she eventually ended up in the hospital, and Taylor would visit her regularly. And it was basically so difficult to find something to talk about because this woman was suffering so much that Sydney Taylor said, I remember at Sedgwin, you used to tell wonderful stories about your childhood. And so then Taylor started writing down this woman's stories. And that was the seed, the genesis of A Papa Like Everyone Else. And she saw it herself as a tribute to a dear friend who had died. Because yes, it all takes place in Europe. The Papa is absent during the whole book. And so unless you have a really strong interest in, cooking customs of the Austro-Hungarian, of shtetls in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it can be a bit tough, to go through. I mean, again, I find it fascinating as an adult, but it certainly doesn't have that same relatability, I would say, as the All of a Kind family books. So then, as you were saying, that editors would say, hey, why don't you write this? And Taylor did try to get other things written. She desperately wanted to write a book about the instruments in an orchestra, but making them alive, like, I don't know, Charlie clarinet or something. And editor after editor said, there is no market for this. Children do not want this. If they want to learn about the instruments, they want a factual book. They do not want this kind of fanciful thing. And she also wrote some easy readers. And she hated it because she felt it was being edited by committee, where it was like you're allowed to use 75 words and you have to deal with these 5 topics and make a story out of it. And it just you could just tell it was not her cup of tea.
So we have a great question to end with, a very rich question. Suzanne asked if there's any discussion or speculation about Sydney's sexual orientation, given some of her difficulty with sexual attraction to men, her choice of name, her delight at being mistaken for a man, etc.
That's a fascinating question. Because, and this comes up in the book, that her daughter identified as lesbian very early on, and Taylor gave her The Well of Loneliness, which is, a classic. It's hard for me to imagine giving that to such a young
It's a little harsh, yeah.
and it's not an easy read, let's put it that way.
But they didn't have The Price of Salt or Bebo Brinker.
They didn't have anything else.
They didn't have anything else. And so clearly her mother was reaching out to that. And there are pictures of Taylor in the 20s when she's with her, that she goes hitchhiking with her husband, and she's wearing these knickers, and she says things about how people mistook me for a boy. She was tiny. She was under 5 feet. And she just looked very young. But we never found anything beyond just the amusement at being mistaken as a boy, finding it sort of, there's sort of a thrill to it. But there was certainly her relations that I was aware of through her entire life and in her correspondence were very much family oriented. So it's the kind of thing that I hesitate to speculate that much without evidence about. Again, we don't have a letter where she's talking about her feelings about sexuality, really. I mean, there's hints of her difficulties with her husband, but how to attribute what the source of their problems might have been when they were both in their early 20s, it's very hard, to say.
Right. Even when you've done amazing archival research, sometimes the archives just don't give you the information that you're looking for. So
right. And also people, I have spoken to family members where they say, it's just not something we talked about. People didn't have the words for it. In a way, we forget in this very verbal age about everything, where that certain things were simply not talked about or not put down on paper.
Well, I want to thank you both, Alex and Lizzie, for being with us tonight, for letting us revisit All of a Kind family and learn more about Sydney Taylor and her impact. And I want to thank everyone in the virtual room for joining our conversation, for sharing your memories of these books, of the Brenners at Sedgwin. I know that the series continues to resonate with young people. Some of our JWA's Teen Rising Voices Fellows have written about the books and how much they love them. In addition to reading From Sarah to Sydney, which I highly recommend, you can also learn about Sydney Taylor and about Jewish children's literature in the US in JWA's encyclopedia. I hope that you will all join us next week, same time, same place, for a discussion with Judy Bolton-Fassman about her book, Asylum, A Memoir of Family Secrets. And the following Thursday for a conversation with Vanessa Zoltan, who some of you may know from the podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, about her new book, Praying with Jane Eyre, Reflections on Reading as a Sacred Practice. You can check out, actually, you can get a sort of sneak peek at our whole book list for the year, which we've just released. We haven't even promoted it yet on our site. And finally, last but not least, please join us on Thursday, November 4th to help us celebrate JWA's 25th anniversary. It is going to be a wonderful multi-generational event, including some star power in honor of our founders and our Teen Rising Voices Fellowship community. And you can find more information on our site at jwa.org/celebrate25. It was really wonderful to be with all of you tonight. And until next time, be well and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.